becoming Germany? Because Nicolas Sarkozy spent quite a lot of time praising the German model, didn't he?
Yeah, you know the old saying, Stuart, that imitation is the best form of flattery, or certainly the most sincerest. And it does look that way, doesn't it, that with Sarkozy perhaps praising the German model, it looks like his direction, or he's certainly looking east, at least, towards Germany. And you have to remember, Germany is seen as this model, if you like, for an export-driven economy, not just for exports. Much of the reason behind Germany's success over the last 10 years is because it went through some fairly painful and dramatic labour reforms around 10 years ago, basically making the German model much more flexible, so that, for example, employers who might be struggling a little bit could put their staff on perhaps part-time work rather than just hiring and firing outright. They got subsidies to do that, to keep those people in employment, keep things ticking over during the lean times, and then bringing them back into the fold on a full-time basis when times are good. And that's the sort of thing that Sarkozy's got in mind with that social VAT, making consumers pay a little bit more for a much more flexible labour market, and making it a little bit easier for employers to actually to actually hire and fire people effectively. So it certainly looks that way, doesn't it? The trouble is, if he wants a short-term measure, I mean, this man presumably wants to be re-elected in a few months' time. This is the sort of thing that takes years. It's not an overnight fix. Cutting VAT, for example, to put a little bit more money in people's pockets, that's a sort of short-term fix that gives people a little bit of a lift. This will take a long time to implement. It will certainly take much longer than 3 months before the French elections. Well, the other big thing, of course, during that primetime address, or that primetime television interview, was the whole thorny issue of the financial transaction tax, or the so-called Tobin tax. Sarkozy has gone it alone very much on this, not only by setting out a timetable for implementing this tax, but by now suggesting that France will go it alone completely and become the first country in the Eurozone to start taxing deals on share trading. Yuka Roya has more details.
The French president devoted most of his hour-long interview to explain his plans for boosting the country's economy. He stressed new taxes will be needed to fill state coffers, even if they're controversial.
We have also finally decided to create a tax on financial transactions. We hope it will raise €1 billion a year for the government budget and help reduce the deficit. What we want is to trigger a shock and set an example.
He said such a tax would make banks pay for the financial crisis they brought about. Britain has vetoed the idea of a EU-wide financial transaction tax. Sarkozy says France is ready to introduce the 0.1% tax anyway on French shares, a measure that could put Paris market at risk. The French president also set out a plan for the so-called social VAT, a raise in sales tax to fund a reduction in private firms' social contributions. It's another controversial idea, as it makes consumers pay for retirement and other social benefits. Sarkozy said the measure would help increase jobs, and also said the notorious 35-hour work week system should be changed. The president said the new taxes would save €13 billion and help boost the country's growth. Despite the recent downward revision of growth and credit downgrade, Sarkozy said France was on track to meeting its target for budget deficit reduction this year.
OK, well, let's get a little bit more on this whole financial transaction tax. Let's cross to London and to Philippe Baudreau. He's the senior vice president at PIMCO's UK office. It's the world's largest bond fund. Philippe, good morning to you. Many thanks for joining us here on the Business Show. You must be feeling a little bit torn this morning. You're a Frenchman in London looking at a financial transaction tax being imposed by a French president that very few financial centres, certainly the City of London, really want.
Yeah, so I think you can see where Sarkozy is coming from, and the idea that Tobin tax has been around for quite a long time in France and elsewhere. You know, the notion that why should that be the only part of the world that doesn't get taxed is understandable, that you would want to get your hands on that. However, I think operationally it's a very tall order and a very hard thing to implement. And you know what you'll find is obviously that the UK has already said that it wouldn't implement such a tax, and at the very minimum, for something like this to work, you need the implementation at the European Union level. Ideally, you'd want it to work at a global level, but for a single country unilaterally to do this, I think is a little more than a bit of a gadget. You know, that really you can understand that is part of the election process in France rather than anything particularly powerful in my mind.
Philippe, just explain for us, you think that it'll be fairly easy for companies to get around this, and yet Sarkozy was very specific in that address, saying that, for example, if you trade the shares of a French company, for example, in New York or in London, you won't be able to get around this tax because you will be charged for that.
Well, that's possible. I don't know exactly how you do that, by the way, but I assume he's done his homework on that front. But what that does is that it just puts French companies at a disadvantage, brings less liquidity specifically for French companies. I don't think that's what we need right now.
Philippe, let's talk about Greece for just a moment, can we? It seemed to be kind of edging towards a bond swap there. Looks like those investors have been talked down 3.5% coupon on new bonds, but that implies losses of 70%. Is that really a fair deal, do you think?
I think it's not a matter. It's not a matter of fairness, really. It's a matter of bringing debt to GDP of Greece at a level that becomes sustainable, and that 70% haircut goes into that direction, but doesn't really bring us to the right level yet. And you are going to see that the official sector, i.e. the Troika, in the form of the ECB, the European Union and the IMF, I mean, at least two of these players, we think, will need to take haircuts as well on the loans they've made to Greece. So I don't think it's particularly a matter of being fair or unfair on the private sector holders. It's a matter of bringing the Greek debt to GDP at a level that means the country does not collapse.
Philippe, are you saying there that it's up to the ECB, really? It's what the ECB does that matters here. For example, should the ECB be taking bigger haircuts on the amount of bonds it's taken out in Greece?
Right. So, I mean, if you look at on the private sector side, 70%, whether we go at 75 or 80%, doesn't really move the needle massively. What we do know is that, in our mind at least, that 120% debt to GDP, 130%, which would be the level post PSI, that level is not really sustainable in a country that's going through a massive recession, massive budget deficits, and at some point the ECB and potentially the EU should probably take a haircut as well.
Let's talk bailout funds now. I mean, they seem to be looking at running two bailout funds alongside each other, the ESM and the EFSF, to create a big enough safety net, really. Do you think that's the best approach?
It isn't the best approach, but we don't live in a world of best choices or first choices. So I think it is. If they do that, I think it's better than having only one of those vehicles being operational. It would increase the firepower of Europe to support countries, and it would ultimately, potentially bring a big enough firewall. I mean, an ideal solution in my mind was always for the ECB to run with a big QE program of buying Italy and Spain government bonds and bringing the yields down. But we know that politically that hasn't been possible. So view that as a second best alternative, I guess.
Philippe Bordereau, Senior Vice President at PIMCO's UK office. Thanks very much for talking to us today here on France 24. Right, Owen, you're going to have a look at the markets. A bit of a nervy start to the week before the big EU summit kicks off.
When was it ever not like that, though, before an EU summit? You have to ask that question. Absolutely right. And some fairly miserable earnings out. Let's give you the European markets going into that summit, which incidentally kicks off at around 2 p.m. Paris time. You can see they're all down. The CAC 40 here in Paris are around 0.8% down. I mentioned some miserable earnings, not for everyone, but certainly for Philips, the Dutch electronics company. Just cannot sell televisions right now. And that's partly what's led it to a loss for the last quarter of 162 million euros. Just Ryanair actually reporting some decent earnings, up around 13% after a loss on the previous year. That was for the last quarter. The Asian markets, similar sort of picture to Europe, really. The Nikkei down around 0.5% at the close. And you can see there the Hang Seng, the Shanghai Composite, extending those losses too.
Excellent stuff. All right, Owen, thank you very much. That's Owen Fairclough, our business editor here on France 24. Back, of course, tomorrow. Now let's move on and bring you a few other stories from around the world. And a strong earthquake measuring 6.3 has shaken an area in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of central Peru. US government researchers say the epicenter was 23 kilometres southeast of the town of Ica at a depth of 39 kilometres. The tremor apparently shook buildings in the coastal capital Lima. The cruise ship that capsized off Italy's coast will take up to 10 months to remove.